Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We're going to wrap up our unit on ancient Asia by continuing with Japan and talking about Japan in the feudal era. Now, in middle school, you probably studied the feudal system in the context of medieval Europe, talking about knights and vassals and all of that. There was a similar system in place in Japan that evolved over time. At the very top was the emperor, and the emperor is like the king in Japan, but it's really more of a symbolic role. According to the Shinto religion, the emperor was divine, got his power from God, but really didn't have a lot of power per se. Instead, the shogun was the person who really ran the show, and the shogun was the supreme military commander and controlled all aspects of the Japanese military, which was very important in a feudal society that relies on warriors and knights and all of that. Below the shogun was the daimyo. Those were the warrior lords, and they were given land by the shogun to control. And in return, if there was ever a war, the daimyo had to pledge his resources and his men to the cause. The daimyo gave land out to the samurai, and the samurai were like the knights. They were the fighting lords, and their primary job was to fight. Now, below them was the peasants, and the peasants were the people who primarily worked the land, and you also have artisans and merchants that you have in any society like that we've talked about so far. Now, you may be aware of the term chivalry. That was the code that knights in medieval Europe had to live by. In Japan, that code was known as Bushido. Bushido was the code of values that all the lords and the shogun had to live by. And it was based on honor and absolute 100% loyalty. And if you violated the code of Bushido, it was considered more honorable to die than to live with that shame. So you do have cases of ritual suicide committed by people who broke that code, and that's known as seppuku. Now, in Japan at this time, a lot of the fighting that took place was actually sort of internal. It was between rival lords. But there was one external force that threatened Japan in the 1200s, and that was the Mongols. We talked about them earlier in the unit, taking over China and most of Asia at this time under the rule of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. So on two separate occasions, the Mongols tried to invade and subdue Japan, in 1274 and again 7 years later in 1281. And coincidentally, both times the Mongols tried to invade, their massive fleet of thousands of ships was destroyed by a typhoon, which is what hurricanes are known as in Asia. And the Japanese referred to these typhoons as kamikaze, or divine wind. The idea was that God had sent this horrible storm down to keep Japan safe and destroy the invading force. And this reinforced for Japan the idea that they were in some way special and protected and superior to surrounding civilizations and countries. Now, even though the Japanese, to a degree, unified to fight back against the Mongol invasion, fighting got worse after that. You have a lot of rival lords, trying to take each other's land. You've got daimyo arming peasants. It was just a big mess for a couple of hundred years, until in the year 1600, a shogun named Tokugawa took power. And Tokugawa was able to unite all of the warring lords in Japan under one strong central system. It was called centralized feudalism. It was feudalism still, but it had one central power instead of being kind of spread out and disjointed. And feudalism was still very strongly in place. The social class systems, the shogun and the daimyo and all of that, the hierarchy was still very, very rigid. But despite that, the economy grew during this time. The population boomed because agriculture was clicking and food was in abundance, and there was very little war because everyone was fairly united at this point. And Tokugawa shogunate ruled for over 200 years until 1868. And we'll talk about what happened after the shogunate fell later on in the year when we talk about the modernization of Japan. One more thing that's kind of important to remember about this time period is that it wasn't very progressive. Even though things were good and the economy was good, there wasn't a lot of social progress. There wasn't a lot of exploration or anything. Japan stayed very isolated, very primitive. Even when you get towards the 1800s, when some countries start to industrialize and modernize, Japan sort of stays behind, and they remain behind until the shogunate falls in the mid-1800s. Now, as the population in Japan grew, you began to get these huge cities like Osaka and Edo. Edo is what is now known as Tokyo. And with those big cities, you get this bustling, emerging arts scene. And one of the major arts in Japan at this time was theater. And there were two distinct kinds of theater that are good to know about. And the first is called Noh, N-O-H. And it was very minimalist in nature. It was performed on a wooden stage. There was no scenery. There was no background. There were really no props. Most of the actors wore masks, and there would be people playing music and chanting, and there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue. It was very symbolic, just people sort of acting things out with their motions instead of actually with words or anything like that. The other important form of theater was kabuki, and kabuki is more dramatic. It's a little bit funnier than Noh plays. You have a little bit of backdrop and some props and some scenery. It would portray just, family life or historical events, things like that. The costumes were very, very elaborate, usually very colorful. The actors wore makeup that was very, very complex and would take up to hours in some cases to apply. Originally, women were allowed to act in theaters, but as the shogunate sort of put these really rigid class systems in place and rules based on gender, women were banned from performing in theater. And that's a tradition that continues to this day in some quarters of Japan, that men only act and dress up as women to perform female roles if they need to. Japan also had literary contributions. In the reading on the emergence of ancient Japan, you may recall reading about the tale of Genji, which was written over 1,000 years ago, and it's considered to be the first ever novel in the history of the world. And that originated in Japan, written by a woman, Lady Murasaki. But most famously, Japan probably known for haiku, at least in America and in the West. Haiku, you're probably familiar with. Short little poem, 17 syllables spread across 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7, then 5. And haiku do not express elaborate thoughts. Haiku is just a fleeting moment, an idea, a thought that is often about nature or something regarding religion or anything like that. In terms of art, Japan known for landscape paintings, of which you see an example there with some trees and some houses and huts, kind of with the mountains in the background there. Very pretty. And they're also known for woodblock prints. These were paintings that were essentially done on wood. And the picture there of the Great Wave is what it's called, is an example of that. A lot of the paintings in ancient Japan also dealt with historical events or famous people. A couple of slides back, you may recall the painting of the Mongol ships being destroyed by the giant waves of the typhoon. That's an example of what we're talking about there. And that'll do it. Be sure to be studying for your unit quiz that'll cover China, Mongolia, and Japan. That's coming up here in a couple of days. Also, on Moodle, I've put up a couple of videos that demonstrate the two types of theater expressed in this video, Noh and Kabuki. I could try to explain it, but I can't do it justice. So go give those videos a look, and you'll see very clear examples of what those theater styles look like. Thanks for listening. As always, ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers.